We often tell ourselves we are defined by what we build, but perhaps we are truly defined by what we allow to disappear. There was a time in America when the measure of a man was not found in quarterly earnings or efficiency metrics, but in the steadiness of his handshake and the precision of his work. There was a time when a small town was not simply a collection of buildings along a highway, but a living organism sustained by invisible threads of trust, obligation, and shared memory. In the 1950s, in 10,000 American small towns whose names you would not recognize, there existed a covenant between people that has since been dissolved, replaced by something we were told would be better, faster, more convenient. But convenience, as we would learn, is a poor substitute for belonging. Close your eyes and remember, if you can, the specific scent of morning in a town of 3,000 souls. Not the generic aroma of mass-produced coffee, but the particular fragrance of Mrs. Henderson's percolator at the corner drugstore. The beans ground fresh each dawn, mixed with the smell of newsprint from papers still warm from the press, with ink that would stain your fingers black. Remember the hollow echo of footsteps on the wooden sidewalk outside Miller's Hardware, where every third board sang a different note under your weight. A wooden symphony that announced your arrival before the brass bell above the door ever rang. Remember the taste of a Coca-Cola drawn from the fountain at Schneider's Pharmacy, served in a glass so cold it hurt your teeth, mixed with syrup from a ratio that Mr. Schneider alone knew, a formula that died with him in 1967, never written down, never standardized, never replicated. Why did we stop demanding that things be irreplaceable? When did we decide that sameness was preferable to character? At what precise moment did American culture collectively agree that the loss of 10,000 individual flavors was an acceptable price for the guarantee that every product would be identical from Maine to California? These are not merely questions of nostalgia. They are questions about what we believed we were and what we have quietly become. The story you are about to hear is not about economics, though economics will explain the mechanism of change. It is not about progress, though progress was the banner under which the transformation marched. This is a story about the quiet, unacknowledged cost of that progress, a cost borne most heavily by a generation that watched their world systematically dismantled and replaced with something more efficient, more profitable, and infinitely more hollow. This is the story of what life was like in a 1950s American small town, and why that life became impossible. In 1955, in a town we will call Millbrook, though it could have been any of 1,000 such places, the rhythm of daily life moved to a tempo that no longer exists. The day began not with an alarm clock, but with the 6:15 whistle from the lumber mill, a sound that carried across 7 miles of farmland and into every bedroom window left open to catch the night breeze. By 6:30, Main Street was alive, not with the roar of commuter traffic, but with the measured pace of men walking to the diner, to the hardware store, to the barbershop that opened early because Tom Fitzgerald believed a man should start his day properly groomed and fully informed about the concerns of his community. The diner, owned by Frank and Dorothy Chen, who had come to Millbrook in 1946 with a recipe for pie crust that had been perfected over 3 generations, was not simply a restaurant. It was the town's circulatory system. By 7 in the morning, every booth was filled, and the counter seated 14 men who occupied the same stools every single day, an arrangement so fixed that a stranger taking the wrong seat would be gently but firmly redirected. These were not arbitrary traditions. They were the visible manifestation of a social order in which every person knew their place, their role, their responsibility to the collective whole. Frank Chen knew every customer by name, knew their orders before they spoke, knew their children, their problems, their politics. When young Billy Morrison's father died in a tractor accident in the spring of 1957, Frank and Dorothy closed the diner for an entire day to organize the funeral, to cook for 100 mourners, to ensure that the Morrison family would not face their grief alone. This was not exceptional generosity. This was the baseline expectation of membership in a community. You contributed not because you expected return, but because the alternative was unthinkable. To fail in your obligation was to exile yourself from the only thing that mattered, your place in the intricate web of mutual dependence that made survival possible. Walk down Main Street in 1955 and you would find 17 locally owned businesses, each one the manifestation of a family's entire existence. Miller's Hardware was not a franchise or a branch of a regional chain. It was the life's work of Eugene Miller, who had opened the store in 1932 with a loan from his father-in-law and who knew the inventory of every nail, every bolt, every tool with the intimacy of a curator. When a farmer came in needing a replacement part for a 20-year-old thresher, Eugene did not consult a computer or order from a centralized warehouse. He walked into the back room, climbed a ladder, and retrieved the exact part from a shelf organized according to a system that existed only in his mind. The part cost $1.15. Eugene wrote the transaction in a ledger with a fountain pen, and if the farmer was short on cash until harvest, the debt was recorded with a handshake and settled 4 months later with interest-free grace. This was not inefficient. This was the highest form of economic sophistication, a system in which trust replaced the need for elaborate contracts, in which reputation was currency more valuable than gold. A man's word was his bond, not because of moral superiority, but because in a community of 3,000 people, where everyone knew everyone else's grandfather, the cost of dishonesty was permanent ostracism. You could not simply move to the next town and start over. Your reputation was your inheritance, and you guarded it with the same ferocity you guarded your home. The barbershop, run by Tom Fitzgerald, was open 6 days a week from 7 in the morning until 7 at night. Tom cut hair the way his father had taught him, with scissors and a straight razor, a process that took 40 minutes and cost 75 cents. But you were not simply purchasing a haircut. You were purchasing entry into the town's central information exchange. In Tom's chair, you learned about the new teacher at the elementary school, about the county commissioner's plan to pave the road to the interstate, about which farmer was struggling and needed help with his harvest. Tom Fitzgerald was not a gossip. He was the town's archivist, the keeper of collective memory, the man who knew where every body was buried, both literally and figuratively, and who used that knowledge to maintain the delicate equilibrium of community peace. The pharmacy, owned by Harold Schneider, was where medicine met morality. Harold had trained as a pharmacist in Chicago before returning to Millbrook to take over his father's store in 1948. He filled prescriptions with exactitude, measuring compounds with scales accurate to 1/10 of a gram, but his true role was as the town's medical advisor. When Martha Hughes came in with symptoms she was too embarrassed to describe to the doctor, Harold listened, diagnosed, and dispensed both medicine and discretion. When the Sanderson boy was drinking too much, Harold quietly stopped selling him cough syrup with codeine and had a word with his father. This was not an invasion of privacy. This was the exercise of communal care, the acknowledgement that in a functional society, no one exists in isolation, and everyone bears responsibility for the well-being of the whole. The general store, owned by the Kowalski family, carried everything from flour to fabric to fishing tackle, all of it sourced from regional suppliers, much of it produced within 100 miles. The quality was extraordinary, not because of superior materials, but because every item bore the implicit endorsement of the seller. When Mrs. Kowalski sold you a bolt of fabric, she was staking her reputation on its quality. If it faded or tore prematurely, you did not call a customer service number or demand a refund from a faceless corporation. You walked back into the store, and Mrs. Kowalski made it right, immediately, without question, because her family's survival depended on your continued trust. This was capitalism in its purest, most humane form, a system in which the profit motive was constrained by the inescapable reality of human relationship. The schools in Millbrook were not merely educational institutions. They were the training ground for citizenship, the place where children learned not just reading and arithmetic, but the unwritten rules of community membership. The elementary school had 140 students and 6 teachers, a ratio that allowed for individual attention impossible in the consolidated schools that would replace them. Miss Anderson, who taught 4th grade for 32 years, knew not only every child in her classroom, but every child's parents, grandparents, siblings, strengths, weaknesses, fears, and dreams. When she assigned homework, she calibrated the difficulty not to a standardized curriculum, but to each child's individual capacity and need. When Tommy Chen struggled with long division, Miss Anderson stayed after school 3 days a week for a month, without additional pay, without formal recognition, because that was what teachers did. They were not employees of a district. They were members of the community, and the success of every child was their personal responsibility. The churches in Millbrook, 3 Protestant denominations and 1 Catholic, were not simply places of worship. They were the architectural embodiment of shared values, the physical spaces where the town gathered to affirm collective identity. On Sunday morning, Main Street was empty because everyone, regardless of their level of belief, was in a pew somewhere. This was not enforced theologically. It was enforced socially. To absent yourself from Sunday service was to declare yourself outside the community, and very few people possessed the courage or the means to survive such exile. The churches organized charity, settled disputes, provided social services that no government agency would offer for another generation. When the Fletcher family lost their home to fire in 1954, it was the Methodist congregation that organized a building bee, and within 3 weeks, a new house stood on the same foundation, constructed by volunteers using donated materials, a feat that would be illegal under modern building codes and impossible under modern insurance law. Life in Millbrook moved slowly by contemporary standards, but it was not simple. Every transaction, every interaction carried weight. Every choice had visible consequences. When you walked down Main Street, you could not be anonymous. You were known, observed, judged, supported, constrained, and protected by the same system. There was comfort in this, the deep animal comfort of belonging, of having a place, of knowing that your existence mattered to people who shared your fate. But there was also pressure, the suffocating pressure of conformity, of constant surveillance, of having every deviation from accepted norms noticed and corrected. This was not a utopia. It was a functioning society, with all the beauty and brutality that implies. The young people who grew up in Millbrook in the 1950s often felt torn between gratitude and claustrophobia. They had been raised in safety, in stability, in a world where everyone knew their name and no one doubted their worth. But they also chafed against the restrictions, against the narrow definition of acceptable life paths, against the unspoken rule that leaving the town was a form of betrayal. The boys who went to Korea and came back, changed, found Millbrook suddenly too small. The girls who went to the state university and encountered ideas not sanctioned by the church council found themselves unable to fit back into the mold that had been prepared for them. And yet, even as they left, even as they built lives in distant cities, They carried Millbrook with them, a template of how human beings should treat one another, a standard against which every subsequent experience would be measured and found wanting. But beneath the surface of this seemingly eternal order, forces were already gathering that would render everything obsolete. In 1956, President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, authorizing construction of 41,000 miles of interstate highway. The stated purpose was national defense, a road network that could facilitate rapid military mobilization in the event of Soviet attack. But the actual effect was economic transformation on a scale not seen since the Industrial Revolution. The interstates would bypass small towns, redirect commerce to urban centers, and make possible the logistics networks that would enable national retail chains to undercut local merchants through economies of scale that were simply impossible to resist. In 1962, Sam Walton opened the first Walmart in Rogers, Arkansas. The initial store was unremarkable, but the philosophy behind it represented a fundamental reimagining of retail. Walton understood that by centralizing purchasing, by negotiating directly with manufacturers, by demanding volume discounts and passing a fraction of those savings to consumers, he could offer prices that no locally owned store could match. It was not a matter of superior service or better products. It was pure mathematics. A store selling 10 million units of an item could demand a per-unit cost that a store selling 1,000 units could never access. The local merchant, bound by personal relationships and community obligation, could not compete. It was not a competition. It was an execution by logistics. In 1955, a hammer at Miller's Hardware cost $2.50. It was manufactured by a regional company, forged from American steel, assembled by workers who earned a living wage, sold by Eugene Miller, who could explain its proper use and would guarantee its quality with his personal reputation. In 1975, a functionally identical hammer at the new Walmart 23 miles away cost 99 cents. It was manufactured in Taiwan, designed for planned obsolescence, sold by a minimum wage employee who had been working there for 3 weeks and knew nothing about hammers beyond the price. Scanner's output. The consumer, offered this choice, did not consider the systemic implications. They saw only the immediate financial calculation, and they chose the cheaper hammer. And then they wondered why Miller's Hardware closed in 1976, why Main Street began to empty, why the town suddenly felt hollowed out, even as they enjoyed the undeniable convenience of lower prices. This was the mechanism of destruction, elegant in its simplicity, irreversible in its logic. The interstate highway enabled national distribution. National distribution enabled economies of scale. Economies of scale enabled price competition that local businesses could not survive. And once the local businesses closed, once the economic foundation of the community collapsed, all the social structures that depended on that foundation began to crumble as well. The diner closed in 1979 when Frank Chen retired, and no one could afford to purchase the business. The building was bought by a regional chain that operated it as a franchise for 4 years before closing it permanently due to insufficient profit margins. The barbershop closed in 1983 when Tom Fitzgerald died, and his children, both of whom had moved to Chicago, had no interest in returning. The building became a tax preparation service that opened 3 months a year. The pharmacy was purchased by a national chain in 1985 and converted into a store where prescriptions were filled by rotating staff pharmacists who worked 8-hour shifts and knew nothing about the customers beyond their insurance information. The personal knowledge, the discretion, the communal care all vanished, replaced by the cold efficiency of computerized inventory management and corporate protocol. By 1995, Main Street in Millbrook was a graveyard. Half the storefronts were empty, their windows dark, their paint fading. The remaining businesses were franchises or chain stores, interchangeable with their equivalents in every other town, offering no products that could not be found anywhere else, staffed by people who did not live in the community and had no investment in its future. The economic logic was undeniable. The chains were more efficient, more profitable, more responsive to consumer demand as measured by purchase data. But something essential had been lost, something that could not be quantified in a spreadsheet or captured in a quarterly earnings report. The generation that had built Millbrook, that had sustained it through depression and war, watched this transformation with a mixture of bewilderment and grief. They had believed that if they worked hard, if they honored their obligations, if they raised their children properly, the world they had built would endure. They had not anticipated that economic forces beyond their control or comprehension would render their entire way of life obsolete. They had not imagined that their children and grandchildren would prefer the impersonal efficiency of corporate retail to the intimate complexity of community commerce. They felt betrayed, not by any individual, but by history itself, by the inexorable logic of progress that valued efficiency above all else and dismissed as sentimentality any argument for preserving what could not be measured. In 1997, Eugene Miller's son donated his father's store ledgers to the County Historical Society. The ledgers, 43 volumes covering 65 years of transactions, represented the complete economic history of the town. Every purchase, every debt, every settlement was recorded in fountain pen, a chronicle of community life that no database could replicate. The Historical Society cataloged the ledgers, stored them in a climate-controlled vault, and occasionally displayed them during heritage festivals. But no one read them anymore. They were artifacts of an incomprehensible past, evidence of a system so alien to contemporary life that it might as well have been archaeological remains from ancient Rome. The churches still stand in Millbrook, but their congregations have dwindled. The young people leave for college and do not return. The old people die and are not replaced. The town's population in 2020 was 1,147, a 62% decline from its 1950 peak. The elementary school was consolidated with 3 neighboring districts in 1998, and now children are bused 40 minutes each way to a regional facility serving 800 students. The teachers do not live in the community. They are not neighbors. They are professionals with education degrees and union contracts, bound by standardized curricula and federal mandates, unable to deviate from approved lesson plans even when common sense demands it. The personal attention, the individual calibration, the deep knowledge of each child's context and capacity, all of that is impossible now, sacrificed to the demands of scale and standardization. The houses in Millbrook are cheap now, some selling for less than the cost of a used car. Young families occasionally move in, attracted by the low cost of living, by the dream of small-town life they have absorbed from movies and television. But they discover quickly that the reality does not match the fantasy. There is no main street to stroll down, no diner where everyone knows your name, no hardware store owner who will spend an hour helping you solve a problem. There is a Dollar General on the highway and a Walmart 23 miles away, and that is the extent of local commerce. The community structures that once made small-town life bearable, the networks of mutual aid and shared responsibility, have atrophied beyond recovery. People live in Millbrook now, but they do not live in community. They are isolated, connected to the wider world through internet and interstate, but disconnected from their immediate neighbors, who remain strangers. Walk down Main Street in Millbrook today, and you will see the architectural ghosts of what was. The buildings remain, but they are empty shells, their windows boarded, their signs faded, their purpose forgotten, The diner where Frank and Dorothy Chen once fed the town is now a gutted ruin. The booths stripped out, the counter smashed, the kitchen where pies were made reduced to a tangle of rusted pipes and broken tiles. Sunlight streams through holes in the roof, illuminating dust motes that dance in the still air. And if you stand very quietly, you can almost hear the echo of conversations that once filled this space, the laughter and argument and gossip that constituted the lifeblood of community. But it is only echo, only memory, only ghost. The barbershop is now a vape store, open erratic hours, run by someone who does not live in town. The pharmacy is a chain outlet with fluorescent lights and a drive-through window where you can pick up prescriptions without ever speaking to a human being. The general store is an antique shop catering to tourists who occasionally drive through on their way to somewhere else, selling the remnants of the town's past to people who see them as quaint artifacts rather than the essential tools of a functioning life. The hardware store is a storage facility. The school is a community center that is used once a month for town council meetings, attended by 11 people. This is what efficiency looks like. This is what progress built. These are the gleaming prizes we were promised when we agreed to sacrifice the old ways. Lower prices, greater convenience, unlimited selection, frictionless consumption. And we got all of that. The Walmart 23 miles from Millbrook offers 47 varieties of hammer at prices ranging from $4 to $40, all of them available for purchase 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You do not need to know the owner's name. You do not need to explain what you are building. You do not need to have a relationship with anyone. You simply scan, pay, and leave. It is faster, cheaper, easier. But something was lost in that transaction, something that cannot be recovered, something that most people under the age of 50 have never experienced and thus do not know to mourn. What was lost was the sense that commerce was an inherently social act, an exchange that bound people together rather than isolated them. What was lost was the understanding that every purchase was a vote, a declaration of what you valued, a contribution to the kind of world you wanted to live in. What was lost was the recognition that the cheapest option carries hidden costs that do not appear on the receipt but accumulate nonetheless. Costs paid in the collapse of community, in the loneliness of modern life, in the haunting suspicion that for all our material abundance, we are somehow poorer than our grandparents were. The generation that built the 1950s small town, that sustained it through its golden age, that fought desperately to preserve it as the forces of consolidation gathered, is almost gone now. They are in their 80s and 90s, the last living witnesses to a world that younger generations cannot imagine. When they try to explain what has been lost, they struggle for language, because the things that mattered most were not the things that can be easily quantified. They talk about knowing your neighbors, about trust, about the feeling of walking down a street where every door was open to you. But to modern ears, this sounds like nostalgia, like the selective memory of old people romanticizing a past that was never as good as they remember. But it wasn't romance. It was real. The 1950s small town was a functional social organism, a system that met human needs for belonging, for security, for meaning, in ways that our current system doesn't even attempt. It was not perfect. It was exclusionary. It was conformist. It was often cruel to anyone who did not fit the narrow definition of acceptable. But it was not nothing. It was not a quaint relic. It was a sophisticated social technology that solved the problem of how human beings can live together in mutual support. And we dismantled it without fully understanding what we were destroying or whether what would replace it could fulfill the same functions. The shopping mall outside of town, the big box stores along the interstate, The Amazon distribution center that employs 200 people in minimum wage jobs processing packages, these are what replaced Main Street. They are more efficient, more profitable, more aligned with the demands of a globalized economy. But they do not create community. They do not generate the social bonds that make a place feel like home. They are transactional spaces designed for the rapid extraction of consumer dollars. And once the transaction is complete, they have no further use for you. You are not a neighbor, a member, a participant in a shared enterprise. You are a customer, and the relationship ends when you leave the parking lot. This is what we chose, collectively, through 10,000 individual decisions that seemed rational at the time. This is what the market delivered when we signaled through our purchases that price was the only variable that mattered. And now we live in the world those choices created. A world of unprecedented material abundance and profound social isolation. A world where you can have anything delivered to your door within 24 hours, but you do not know the names of the people who live next door. A world that is in every measurable way more efficient than the one it replaced, and yet somehow emptier, lonelier, less human. The memory of the 1950s small town persists because it represents something essential about American identity. A vision of what we believed we were building when we set out to create a society based on individual liberty and communal responsibility. That vision was never fully realized, was always compromised by prejudice and exclusion and the brutal hierarchies of class and race. But it existed, and for some people, for some time, it worked. It created places where people mattered, where every life had inherent value, where the social fabric was strong enough to catch those who stumbled. And then we tore it down. Not through malice, but through the accumulated weight of individual choices that prioritized convenience over connection, efficiency over belonging, profit over place. The boomer generation stands at the pivot point of this transformation. They were raised in the old world, in communities that still functioned according to the logic of mutual obligation. They inherited a social infrastructure their parents and grandparents had built, a network of relationships and institutions that made life bearable even when circumstances were hard. And then they watched, over the course of their adult lives, as that infrastructure was systematically dismantled, replaced by corporate systems that were more efficient but infinitely more impersonal. Some of them participated in that dismantling, pursuing careers in the very corporations that destroyed the towns they came from. Others fought against it, trying to preserve what they could, only to discover that the economic forces were too powerful, the logic too implacable, the outcome inevitable. What they know, what they carry with them, is the memory of an alternative possibility, proof that human society does not have to be organized around the principle of maximum efficiency, that there are other values worth preserving even at the cost of economic optimization. They know what it feels like to live in a place where you matter, where your absence would be noticed, where your presence contributes to something larger than yourself. And they know that their children and grandchildren, for all their material prosperity, for all their technological connection, do not have that, cannot have it, because the world that made it possible no longer exists. This is not a story with a happy ending. The 1950s small town is gone, and it is not coming back. The economic conditions that sustained it have been permanently altered. The social capital that animated it has been depleted beyond recovery. The young people who might have rebuilt it have moved away, drawn by economic opportunity or driven by the stifling conformity they associated with small-town life. What remains are the hollow shells of buildings, the fading memories of the elderly, and a pervasive sense of loss that no amount of economic growth can remedy. But the story matters because it reminds us that the way we live now is not the only way we could live, not the inevitable endpoint of human development, not the natural result of progress. It is a choice, one we made collectively, perhaps without fully understanding what we were choosing. And if it was a choice, then other choices remain possible. We cannot resurrect the past, cannot recreate the 1950s small town in all its complexity and contradiction. But we can learn from it, can recognize what it provided that our current system does not, can ask ourselves whether there are ways to rebuild the social fabric that has been torn, to create new forms of community appropriate to our time. The measure of a civilization is not found in its GDP or its technological sophistication. It is found in how it treats the most vulnerable, in whether people feel they belong, in the quality of the bonds between individuals. By that measure, we have failed. We built an economy of astonishing productivity and created a society of profound loneliness. We achieved efficiency and lost meaning. We gained the world and forfeited something essential to our humanity. The last generation to remember what was lost is disappearing. Soon, no one will be left who can testify to the fact that there was another way, that people once lived in communities bound by more than economic transaction, that Main Street was not always empty, that it was possible to know and be known, to give and receive care, to live a life embedded in a web of mutual obligation that was simultaneously constraining and sustaining. When they are gone, the memory will fade, become legend, become myth, and eventually be forgotten entirely. And those who come after will assume that the world as it is now is the world as it has always been, and they will not know to mourn what they never experienced, never knew existed, never understood was possible. That is the final cost of progress, the ultimate price of efficiency. The loss not just of a way of life, but of the very knowledge that an alternative ever existed.